and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our weekend edition. Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us, and we have a lot to cover. Next hour, Chelsey Youman will be with us as well. But Dr. Merrill Matthews got to talk about the jobs report. If for no other reason than President Donald Trump today tweeted, "Great jobs report."
Yes, indeed.
Okay, sometimes he's engaged in hyperbole. Not this time.
Not this time.
We are talking about 158,593,000 Americans working in November, the 24th record of the Trump presidency, adding a whopping 266,000 jobs. That's just almost breathtaking.
It's a big number. It was more than was expected. And given some of the challenges that we had with the GM strike and other things, we weren't sure how that would affect other things, but apparently not much.
Yes,
It turned out to be a very good jobs report. The stock market jumped. Democrats groaned. But it does raise a question, because we've talked for some time about Trump's trade policies. I'm generally critical of them in some areas because I tend to be more of a free trader. A lot of economists do. Feeling like that hurts the global economy. The global economy has been struggling, but for all those things, we're still doing well on the jobs report, and the economy's still pretty strong, even though there's some underlying soft spots with business investment and so forth. It allows Donald Trump to come out and say, "I'm proving the people wrong. We can have trade wars and a strong economy."
Let's talk about those trade wars, because I have a commentary coming out on Monday in which I was quoting a little bit from Victor Davis Hanson saying, well, with the impact of the trade war, not a whole lot, because the economy's humming and unemployment's at record lows, and I'm going to give that in just a minute. There are some that are even suggesting, that's CNBC and a couple of others, that this is a situation in which the economy in the United States is doing well. The economy in China is doing poorly, which means talk about leverage that the president has,
right,
and the opportunity to really make some kind of really significant changes. This is a good example of some of the free traders out there, including some of the people I know you've had speak for you at IPI over the years, who have said, man, we might put up with it for a while. Steve Moore, for example, because the ultimate goal would be achievable. And the pain for a few of the farmers, if you're selling soybeans right now, it's kind of tough.
I think we're about $28 billion right now in total handouts.
Yeah, so that's been kind of the way to ameliorate, if you will, or deal with some of those kinds of problems. But it does give the president an incredible strong hand now talking with China.
It does, and we may take the message, the country may take the message from this that you can have trade wars and still have a strong economy, and I think that would be a terrible message to take, but it's hard to argue against it if President Trump steps up and says, I've got more trade wars going than anybody ever did. We've got the strongest economy. Makes it hard. It's a similar thing with inflation, because, remember, the notion had always been if you create a lot of money, if you flood the market with money, inflation goes up. And so when the Fed was doing was taking money and
easing,
quantitative easing and so forth, and putting a lot of money in the market, there was concerns this is going to just blow the cap off inflation. Never happened. So a number of things that we typically have felt in economics may not have been proved wrong yet, but at least we've got to come up with some answers as to why this is happening.
I would certainly say so, and I'm not going to turn to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has an economy degree, to try to explain it, but somebody's going to have to do some splaining to do. Let's just for a second, we've been talking about the jobs, but I thought I'd just get into the unemployment rates, because that's another thing we learned in Economics 101, that you never really are going to drop below about 4 or 5% in unemployment, because there are just certain people that by definition are unemployable for all sorts of reasons. Oh, yeah? Adult men, 3.2%. Adult women, 3.2%. Teenagers, 12%. Whites, 3.2%. The highest one, blacks, 5.5%. But again, these are the record low unemployment, the best unemployment figures we've ever had in 50 years. And again, that's another one where some of these economists are going to say, maybe we misestimated where the bottom is, because 3.2%. I mean, you're talking about people now that literally don't want to work.
Right. Economists used to talk about full employment, and in the early days, that sort of meant everybody working. But then they came up and said, really, full employment under like 4% really is probably not that possible or sustainable, simply because you have normal turnover, people leaving the job, looking for other jobs, and so forth. And so generally it was considered 4 to 5% could be considered full employment, but we've been under that for a while now. And that's looked very well. In fact, what's happening now, the problem is so many companies not able to find workers, because there's too many job openings out there, which is why President Trump's effort to try to force people who are receiving welfare to get back in the workforce, that's a good step, because we need those workers.
And again, as we talk about this idea of job growth, just before we take a break, let me just mention something else, and that is every time they come in with these estimates, and they are estimates, it was revised up in September, an additional 13,000, was revised up in October, another 28,000. So I think you can kind of see the trend going here.
There is a trend there, but just for the listeners, they do revise these things. This is the first estimate. They usually come out with a second and then a third, and that the third ends up being the final one, I believe.
Yeah, and so we'll see where that takes us. But some other things, I got these from the White House as well, not only with job growth, but earnings keep increasing. You talked about the increase there in the stock market. October marked the 16th consecutive month that the measure of wage growth was at or above 3%. Again, remember that magic wand that President Barack Obama was talking about, the joke that he was making? Because what in the world does Donald Trump know about creating jobs, and why does he think that we'll ever get at 3%? Why does he think we'll ever bring back manufacturing jobs? All that sort of happened, hasn't it?
You do have some manufacturing jobs coming back in some areas. Reading last night in the Wall Street Journal that furniture has started to make a comeback. And, of course, Apple did an announcement here about a week or so ago. Donald Trump came down to Texas for that. Apple is opening a manufacturing place here, and he was praising them for moving some of that out of China.
Yeah, it's funny, too. I got to tell the joke, though, for just a second. He says he's opening the Apple factory, and I'm going, it was open a long time ago, Mr. President. Okay, never accuse the person in the White House these days of humility. Okay, so we understand that. But one more point just before we take a break. Matt Vespa has a great line. The latest jobs report was not kind, ... to Democrats. I mean, can you imagine? We'll come back a little bit later, especially when Chelsey joins us to talk about the issues that the Democrats are running on. Obviously, right now they're running on impeachment. But if you're running on the economy, how in the world do you say, I can do better than this? I don't know how you even address this issue.
It's tough.
So anyway, we're going to take a break and we'll come back and want to get into a couple of things that Dr. Merrill Matthews has written about and others have as well. One of those is, okay, if you wanted to balance the budget, he's got a way we can cut $640 billion pretty quickly. We'll talk about drug prices and a variety of other issues that we oftentimes talk about with him. And I might just mention that as we start our national hour, we'll talk about the impeachment hearings that have taken place this week. Of course, they started originally in the House Intelligence Committee, now in the House Judiciary Committee. And the articles of impeachment are probably going to be drafted, so we'll talk about what that means. So we have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the American creed? That is a question David Glertner asks in his book, America Light. He has been on my radio program to talk about his book and his op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. He is a fascinating individual. He received 2 degrees in classical Hebrew literature, but then became a professor of computer science at Yale University. Some have called him a rock star in the world of computing. You might remember that he was one of the people who was critically injured when he opened a mail bomb sent by the Unabomber. He believes that we need to return to the principles that made this country great. Unfortunately, he says, many of us don't know what they are or think they can't work. He blames the public schools and the academy for this failure to pass on the basic ideals that have served America so well for centuries. He laments that almost no one believes that our public schools are doing a passable job of teaching American and Western civilization. Textbooks and class lectures in our education system today often start with the assumption that America and Western ideals are bad for civilization. He concludes that many American children have never heard a good word for the United States, the West, Judaism, or Christianity their whole lives. He also laments that our American culture is in the hands of intellectuals, which he says are usually people born with high IQ and low common sense. He gives lots of examples of this. You can probably think of many other examples of people who are very bright but lacking in basic common sense. America's creed is quite simple: freedom, equality, democracy, and America as the promised land. The early founders believed in America as a city on a hill, as did many presidents right up to President Reagan. It is time to use our American creed to evaluate those who are teaching our kids and those who are leading our nation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and this week I saw a piece that he wrote and found it, of course, on ipi.org. You can find it some other places as well. I got mine from MailChimp because they always mail it to me anyway, but it's, quote, an easy way to cut $640 billion from the federal budget. Now, the word easy is got in quotes because it's easy because of the mechanics, but it brings us down, Dr. Merrill Matthews, to something that has always been a puzzle to anybody that started looking at the budget. We collect all this money through the federal government, and then the federal government then trickles back to the states some of that money. And, of course, there's an overhead, a rather substantial overhead by sending
carrying charge, let's say.
I mean, this is aggressive. You know, whether you're talking about welfare, if we took all the money spent on welfare and just gave it to the poor, they'd be better off than all the money that goes in the pockets of people that are getting six-figure income for the bureaucracy and things like that. And here, this one has to do with just the states who are addicted, as you said, to federal largesse, and there is a way we could streamline this. So talk about it.
Right. The Pew Research Center recently came out with its study. It does this fairly often, but they look at how much money the federal government spends in the states and breaks that down by state. But it's a total of about $639 billion, I think, for fiscal 2017. So that money gets handed out. But all of that money ultimately goes to the federal government, comes from you and me and businesses that pay taxes. And so the money goes from the states to the federal government. Then they turn around and hold it up there for grabs, and we have to go beg to get some of it back. And there's this huge competition among states to try to get the most money back. And they take a great deal of pride if they're able to get more federal dollars back than another state. And then, of course, with the Medicaid expansion, Those states that have not expanded Medicaid, Texas being one, the governor, the high officials tend to get just pounded by people who say, this is free money out here. It's money for the taking. You need to go and take that money and bring it back. And what I simply suggest is, why are we running it through Washington? I mean, why not cut taxes by an amount that gets rid of that $640 billion? Some states may be willing to raise their taxes themselves, but that way people who are benefiting from these services and products and so forth are paying the taxes for it. So I would much rather other states, if they want to build something major, it shouldn't be coming from Texas. I'd much rather do it the other way around. If we want to do something in Texas, we pay the taxes and do it. If somebody else wants to, they're free to do it, but don't make me pay for somebody else's benefits.
The arguments against this, I can only think of a couple. One's political, one's economic. The political one's pretty obvious, and that is the bureaucrats, the members of Congress. They love that because they can control the situation. And so even though they're drawing money from the state of Texas or the state of Connecticut or whatever it might be, it trickles back. That's one of the biggest roadblocks, because then it takes away the political power both of politicians in Congress as well as some of the people in the fourth estate or the bureaucracy.
Exactly
so
right.
That's the political one. There is at least, and this is the only argument that I could see that has some real importance, the economic argument, and that is sometimes certain states contribute less to the federal government because they don't have as good a tax base. We can sit here right now. We're broadcasting in the state of Texas. Most of our listeners today are in Texas, although there's some in Minnesota and a variety of other places. Most of them are in Texas. We could say, yeah, we'll just take care of it on our own. But I just used the example of Connecticut, or I can pick some others, Wyoming with a small tax base. Some of them are saying, yeah, we just don't have the ability to raise enough taxes to build that bridge, to build that dam, whatever it might be, to provide education, infrastructure, welfare, whatever it might be. So that's sort of an argument, but it isn't a really powerful one if you recognize that most of the time we have evidence that people are being overtaxed.
Yeah, your point is well taken, and what I'm doing, and that's a little bit of a hyperbole in there, because you could say, well, for disaster relief, maybe that should still be the federal government handing out some money. But you're right. A number of states tend to have lower incomes, Mississippi being one.
Yes, another one.
And some of those states tend to be, on balance, they get more back than they send out. Not a lot more, but they do get more back than they send there. So you could make a case for that. The problem is if you open it up to say, all right, we're going to cut this way back, but we're only going to help the lower income states, then everybody else feels like the money's being out there and they want to try to make the case. So Texas, which is tends to be a moderate income state, we've got a lot of high income people, we've got a lot of low income people as well. But we've got a really strong economy, but we go and try to get that money as well, just like everybody else.
I know. And so, again, the argument would be not only that there may be a little bit of a situation where some of these states don't have a lot of income. I was thinking of Mississippi just a minute ago in terms of the tax base. But, again, some of these small states, Rhode Island, Connecticut, things like that, they just don't have a lot of taxpayers per se. So they might be there. But, again, if you recognize that there is this surcharge, this rather dramatic surcharge up there, that really a significant amount, and the last time I looked at this goes back to some Ralph Nader statistics, which shows how old they are, but nevertheless, on the amount of money, and I think Marvin Olasky did this on welfare, the amount of money that goes and the amount that trickles back, but in round numbers, sometimes almost 3/4 of the amount of money that's sent stays in Washington or in the federal government, and only about 1/4 of it trickles back, which tells me that the economic argument isn't very powerful either, because even the money that you do send in there, if you just had to fund it yourself, you'd be a lot better off.
Yeah, and so that's why the notion should be that we should be changing our perspective such that the money should be taxed and spent in the state. Maybe there's going to be a few exceptions, but generally should stay within the state where it's going to. And that's the kind of state competition you want. You want competition among states for lower taxes. They don't like that in Washington. You want competition for less regulations.
Right.
That encourages people to move from a state to a state in order to find the place where the state policy sort of best match their values, and that's what federalism is all about.
Again, one of the other things that we always depend upon you on is health care issues, and you point out in here the process of the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion is a good example of that. Talk about that for just a minute, because under the law, the federal government would cover 100% of the additional cost, but after a couple of years, it would begin to drop down. And so there's another part of that, because he who has the gold makes the rules. It's the golden rule. And so that's the other issue, that there have been some that have said, I don't want to take on that Medicaid expansion because eventually we will end up having to pay for it anyway, right?
Exactly right. And that was one of the issues that came up when they passed the Affordable Care Act. It required every state to expand Medicaid. The Supreme Court, in its decision, that said, yes, the mandate to have health insurance is constitutional, but the mandate to require states to do this or lose all of their Medicaid funding is not. So states had the option of being able to opt in for the Medicaid expansion, which would raise the eligibility level for Medicaid. The federal government was going to pay 100% of that for those new enrollees for 3 years, and then begin to reduce it down to 90%. And I remember as this was going on, Ken Paxton, before he became Attorney General, who was talking to me, he said, we can't afford the 10%, and the federal government darn sure can't afford the 90%.
That's such a great line. We need to take a break. When we come back, I want to get into a couple of other issues. First of all, this one about cutting the federal budget is on our website, so that gives you an opportunity, first of all, to look at this, and maybe even next time there's a town hall meeting, you got a member of Congress say, yeah, what about this? Why do we do this? And see if there will be any interest on the part of your member of Congress in that regard. If you'd like to know more about the Institute of Policy Innovation, IPI.org, we have a link there, also under the picture there of Dr. Merrill Matthews, so you can find some of that as well. And when we come back, we're going to get into a couple of other issues, one on drug price controls, which is really a big issue right now that's being raised by the Democrats. So we want to help you get an answer to that. And then we've had Phil Kerpen on the program here. A little bit of hyperbole here. ARP is just a for-profit insurance company, but I just, since Dr. Merrill Matthews sent that along, I thought, okay, let's get into that one as well. Those are all on our website, pointofview.net. And as you go to our website, let me just mention that up until yesterday, you saw that we still had the Giving Tuesday banner on there. That's because we had a matching fund for Giving Tuesday, and we didn't meet it on Tuesday, so I thought, well, we'll carry it on to Wednesday. Found out we hadn't made it until Thursday. I'm pretty sure we've made it now. And I forgot to ask what the numbers are, but we'll certainly give you an update on that by the top of the next hour in terms of that. But that's all the more reason to say, now that we are past, and now that Giving Tuesday's in our rearview mirror, you can still join with us, and I hope that all of you, whether you gave on Tuesday or not, and I know most of you perhaps did not, before year end, we are going to have a very, very significant match for year end giving. So this is a good time already here on the 6th of December to begin to think about what you want to do between now and year end. And all of that is available at the website, pointofview.net. The articles we've been talking about, the articles we're going to be talking about are there. And also hope you'll click on that button that says join the team. We certainly need you to be part of our financial team. And if you can help us out, we'd greatly appreciate it. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Merrill Matthews right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dyes would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Merrill Matthews. It is our weekend edition. If you'd like to join us, by the way, we're going to be talking about the whole issue of drug prices and drug price controls. Why? Because all sorts of Democrat candidates are talking about this, not just the presidential candidates. It's showing up in a lot of different places. And so Derek Hunter has written a piece called Drug Price Controls Are a Bad Idea with a Lot of Support. And he says the idea of price controls is an easy sell to people who don't know any better, especially since you're going after the faceless drug companies, and everybody talks about big pharma. And I'm not here to defend it, but at the same time, he says, the prescription drug industry is easy to demonize because it's faceless and has a lot of money. Let's, if we can, get into what that means, because almost all of the candidates at one time or another, when they start talking about health care, of course, we can get back to Medicare for All in just a minute, but I can't think of an individual, whether they support Medicare for All or don't support it, don't say that what we need are drug price controls, right?
Right. The major bills out there, Nancy Pelosi has her bill. That's the House bill. And then there's a Senate bill that's considered to be a little more moderate, but Trump had said he liked the Senate bill better, but it doesn't look like that's going to go anywhere either, because they've tried to water it down, but they've tried to change it some so that it's beginning to lose the Democratic support. And they've even in the House bill are looking at making a few changes, which the progressives have said, if you do that, we're not going to support it. So we don't know that we're going to get anything done on actual legislation. Now, President Trump has instructed Alex Azar, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to come up with some rules for allowing Americans to import drugs from other countries. He's supposed to have those sort of guidelines set up in January. I guess there'd be a comment period or something, but it's been true for 20 years that if the if the Secretary of Health and Human Services can guarantee that importation of drugs by individuals would be safe, then we're allowed to do it. But no other HHS secretary has been willing to do that because they felt there were too many problems with this. We'll see what Alex Azar decides to do.
Yes.
So the price controls issue is it is an easy thing to do, because what's happening in the drug industry is the drug companies are changing. Years ago they focused typically on what we called small molecule drugs. These were simple compound drugs that they could make. They oftentimes went to millions of people took them, and so they were able to spread those costs over an awful lot of people. For the last 15 or 20 years, they've increasingly focused on what we call rare diseases. Those people with fewer than 200,000 cases, and often they're looking at 25 to 50,000 cases in the country. They're taking it virtually costs the same, actually a little more, to do these biologics that they're doing for these rare drugs. Rare diseases. A biologic is an injectable. It's a live protein. It's a live material that they put in, usually by injection or infusion. So it's typically not a pill. It's much more complicated to make. It is much more complicated to maintain and to deliver. So all of those are problems. And then it goes for the same amount, essentially for research and development, but you're able to spread it over, say, 20,000 people. And so the costs are going up significantly.
Of course.
Just because, and we want the drug companies doing this.
Yes.
The real challenge is to find a way to pay for these in ways that encourage the drug companies to continue these things, continue this research and development, and yet doesn't sort of overwhelm families with the cost.
Well, and that's part of the problem, because in this article it says it costs more than $1 billion to bring a new drug to the market. Okay, assuming that that's an accurate number.
It's easy to calculate that, because I've taken the drug companies announce what they spend on research and development, and we know how many drugs are approved every year. And so it works out to about $1.7 billion per approved drug. That's out-of-pocket cost. If you hear people talk about $2 or $2.5 billion, they're including what's called the opportunity cost. If I'm a drug company and I've got a $1.5 billion, if I invested over here in some bonds or something and I'm able to make 2 or 3 or 4% over 10 years to develop a drug versus and put it over here in a drug. So some economists add the opportunity cost in there. I don't. I'm just simply saying direct out of pocket. If you divide their research and development cost by the number of drugs approved every year, and because that number jumps up and down a little bit, so I average it over 10 years. It works out to be about $1.7 billion per approved drug.
And again, you take your math, and again, I went to a government school, so my math may be off here, but again, you take $1 billion or $1.6 billion and divide it by 1 million people, not such a big cost.
Right.
Divide that by 20,000, it's a big cost. And so that's the first issue. And Nancy Pelosi's solution is, well, we will tell you what the price is.
Right.
And if you don't agree, then we'll take away your patent, almost, is what she seems to be implying.
Well, what she says is we're going to impose a fee on you, a tax of up to 90%. I think it starts out a little lower, 75%, goes up to 90% after a year, of all the revenue, not just the profit, but all the revenue you get from the drug. So if you have a drug that's making $1 billion, that has $1 billion a year in sales, you would be giving $900 million to the government. So that is not actually a negotiation. She wants to say that's negotiating. But if you're going to take 90% of my of the revenue of this drug, and you're going to use it to say you're keeping the federal government cost in lines because you're applying that towards the federal government, it's not a negotiation. It's basically you're holding me over a barrel. I either have to do it or I lose all that money.
Yes. And one of the other things that Derek Hunter says is that if we go the way of the rest of the world, we'll end up living like the rest of the world, because the way he's getting at that is we do have some very innovative drugs that have come from other countries, Israel and places like that, and France and Germany. But most of it is coming from the United States. And so when Bernie Sanders stands up there and talks about the cost of drugs and the fact that we can get drugs cheaper in other countries, well, there's some other reasons for that, aren't there?
And one of the things that I think people are not that aware of is those countries with a single payer, a government-run healthcare system. If the drug comes in and the government says, we just don't want to spend that much money, we've got tight budgets. Britain's going through this right now with the NHS. There's debates between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn on the candidates for prime minister on how much they need to spend on the NHS, because they realize they've conceded the system is in a mess, the National Health Service. So if the National Health Service is strained and you've got a new drug there that could help many people, but they don't feel like they can afford it, you in Britain, you just don't get the drug.
Well, and again, if we went to Medicare for all, which, as I said in one of my columns coming out in the future, is really no Medicare at all. Right. Because it basically is not Medicare at all. But even whatever you end up with, if the government determines what's on the formulary, that's kind of the formal word there, then we will allow you to get these drugs but not these others. And so in some cases on the formulary is the generic. You might say, well, if the generic's cheaper, fine, but sometimes the generic is not as effective. There may be allergic reactions. There are all sorts of things associated with it, aren't there?
Right. What they do, they go to what's called a step theory or fail first. That is to say, we're going to put you on the generic first. If that doesn't work, then we'll move to one that's more expensive. If that doesn't work, we'll move to another one that's more expensive till we find the one that works. But that's only a cost-saving measure. It is not because I necessarily, as a doctor, think that's the best option for you.
Yeah, and that's the problem, because once you start having bureaucrats making that decision, the doctor already can figure out what has worked for him or her in the past with patients with the same kind of symptoms. But when the bureaucrat is saying, no, you've got to step your way through to finally get the one that you already know is going to work,
and here's
it's
a careful
just frustrating.
thing. Yeah, what the Democrats will say is, no, we make this available. If this doesn't work and the doctor thinks his or her decision is better, they have the ability to go through this process to get the other drug approved for that person. But that means the doctor has to stop everything else, get on the phone or do something and go and try to get the right person online in order to be able to convince them that that's the right one. And doctors don't always have that time.
And again, if you would like to have a feel for what that's like, have you ever gotten an erroneous charge on your credit card and then had to wait on hold so that you could finally clear that up? Or if you've ever tried to get approval for a loan because somebody put the wrong piece of information in there, you have a pretty good understanding about that is not the way to do medicine. So we're going to take a break, but I did want to commend to you this one by Derek Hunter. More and more what we're going to be doing over the next couple of months is talking about some of the issues that are being proposed. And this month we have another one of those Democratic debates. Takes place 6 days before Christmas. I doubt anybody's going to be watching it, but nevertheless, that's the case. You're going to hear again, and certainly I can guarantee it, certainly from Elizabeth Warren, from Bernie Sanders, maybe even Joe Biden. Now, Tom Steyer's there as well, a couple others. They're all going to say that, we need to actually implement drug price controls. And if you say, well, is there an answer to that? Yes, I think this piece by Derek Hunter, and of course some of the material that Dr. Merrill Matthews writes about on IPI.org will be something that you will find. When we come back, just an interesting piece about ARP. That is an organization that has been in the news in the past, but how does it relate to the insurance companies? And a lot of people have said, well, I might want to rethink whether or not I want to join ARP. Well, you'll also find out a little more about how that has influenced the insurance companies and how it, in a sense, is becoming a de facto insurance company. We'll be right back.
Candidates on the far left are proposing to tax the rich big time. They need revenue to fund their massive spending plans and also want to deliver their version of economic justice to the country. Senator Elizabeth Warren says, "We want to build an America that works for the people, not one that just works for rich folks." She has unveiled tax proposals that, added together, would push federal tax rates for some multimillionaires and billionaires above 100%. Senator Bernie Sanders wants an annual tax of 1 to 8% on the wealth of joint filers whose assets are valued at $32 million or above. Columnist Megan McArdle of The Washington Post finds it strange that Senator Warren is so appealing to affluent voters. She points out that there is one thing a wealth tax can do better than anything else: destroy fortunes. Both Senators Warren and Sanders ignore the fact that Europe has tried wealth taxes and mostly rejected them because they didn't work. Sweden's 70s-era wealth tax was relatively small, but still drove out some of the country's brightest citizens, like IKEA founder Ingvar Kamprad, before the country repealed it. Germany had a 0.5 to 0.7% tax on personal and corporate wealth for nearly 2 decades before dropping it. Some on the left want to reimpose it, but studies show this would shrink gross domestic product by 5% and employment by 2%. Some 70,000 millionaires have left France since 2000 because of its wealth tax. Of the 12 European countries that had wealth taxes in 1990, only 3 have them today. The revenue raised just wasn't worth the administrative burden or the damage to the economy and the jobs picture. The wealth tax is immoral. It's a confiscatory tax on assets accumulated from work, thrift, and investment that have already been taxed once. The Wall Street Journal calls it the ultimate populist envy tax. We must avoid it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us. And let me just mention, next hour we'll have, of course, our national program. Chelsey Youman will be with us as well, and we'll be getting into all sorts of issues, everything from job growth and the economy to, of course, we've had these impeachment inquiries. A little bit more that we've learned about Democrats and their stance on abortion and a variety of other topics. But since we have Dr. Merrill Matthews here, I thought we'd stay on some of the health care issues. And you sent this to me the other day. I thought it'd be kind of fun. Phil Kerpen's been on with us before. It's John Decker and Phil Kerpen. ARP is just a for-profit insurance company. Okay, a little bit over the top. But the point he's making is that most people, Dr. Matthews, would think that the American Association for IT People would be kind of a neutral arbiter of health care plans and those kinds of things. But
Right.
the reality is it's not necessarily the case.
ARP makes $600+ million a year off selling health insurance.
Yes, so there you go.
Huge amounts of money. Several years ago, and what this is this is an association. It's the other type of what we call association health plan.
Right.
Trump talks about association health plans. This is a different one. This is an association, and this has been going on for years. That various types of associations would offer health insurance to their individuals if you want to do it. I'm actually on the board of an association that used to offer health insurance, but Obamacare sort of largely killed that. But I got a call probably 15 years ago from an editor of from a writer, reporter at the Wall Street Journal saying, "Do you think it's appropriate for associations to sell health insurance?" To allow people, I mean, they have an insurance company, and the insurance company is just underwriting it for people in that association.
Right.
And I said, yeah. And he said, well, don't you think that's unethical? I said, what do you think about AARP? Mm-hmm. And he said, well, I think it's a great consumers organization. I said, it was started as an association to provide health insurance to retired teachers back in the 50s. That's why I was there. They initially aligned with a company called Colonial Penn and sold health insurance, various types of health insurance through to retired teachers for decades. Several years ago, a couple of decades ago, probably now, they went over to United Healthcare.
Yeah.
It was a big loss for Colonial Penn, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But yes, they sell health insurance from their Medigap policies and other things through ARP. And they get a nibble off all of those policies that they sell. Now, you may say it's a good seniors consumers group, advocacy group, or something like that, but they make a ton of money off selling health insurance.
Well, and again, if you're making $627 million, it's you're not really being perceived, I think, by most people as being an arbiter of trying to just give people some options for what they might want to do as retired people, right? And so that's going to be the issue.
That's exactly it, yes.
Yeah.
And so they are in the health insurance business. They are not a health insurer. Phil kind of implies that they are a health insurer. Yeah. They contract with an insurance company, and they make a lot of money from doing that.
But again, if you talk about United Health, it's the nation's largest health insurer, and they sell the Medigap coverage. So again, that's part of the issue there as well. And as I understand, there's some lawsuits and some other things. So what about that? Because that's kind of become a big issue as well in terms of ARP, right?
Well, it has. And the question is whether or not ARP represents people very well, and they are, especially seniors. And I don't feel that they do. Story going back several years ago, there in Social Security, you can take Social Security anytime from age 62. At age 70, you have to take it. There is a earnings limit from between 62 and up to 66 now. It used to be 65. And if you take Social Security before that, you get, if you make more than around $15,000, $14,008, $800, $15,000 a year, Social Security starts taking away $1 for every $2 you make above that. It's called the earnings penalty. I thought it was bad to have the earnings penalty in there. So I called AARP and said, shouldn't we work together to try to get rid of this earnings penalty in there? And they said, no, we don't want to do that because we think people might take the Social Security earlier than they otherwise would. And I said, Social Security statistics show that nearly 80% of the seniors take Social Security early. Nearly 80%. So if you think that earnings penalty is there to discourage people from taking it early, it's not doing a very good job.
It's certainly not. 80%. I had no idea that percentage was that high.
It's down a little bit from there. I think it's down into the mid-70s now, but it's a huge percentage take it early. Now, that may be 63 or 4. It doesn't necessarily mean it's 62, but an awful lot of people take it early, and they face that earnings penalty. So I said, let's get rid of it. Indeed, there used to be an earnings penalty when you got 66 if you continued working. In 2000, that passed the thing to eliminate that earnings penalty for those who hit full retirement age, 65 then, now 66, passed unanimously in the House and Senate under Bill Clinton. Mm-hmm. So I've been trying to get rid of that earnings penalty, but AARP fights it. So I have I have nothing good to say about the organization.
Well, and I thought I'd post it here because over the years we've had people calling in and saying, I want you to promote the alternative. We've talked about some of those in the past. Others have said they really don't represent me, but this is just one more issue just to pay attention to. I had no idea until I saw this piece that you sent, $627 million. That's in 2017. They're doing pretty well just from selling insurance.
And that doesn't count dues. That's just selling insurance and other things that they endorse and so forth. So yes, they make a huge amount of money as being a conduit for an insurance company.
Just a few minutes, we're going to start our national program, but I thought just before we do so, Penna Dexter's commentary today is about the wealth tax. And we've talked about this before. Back in Sweden, for example, during the 1970s, they had a wealth tax and it drove everybody out. The IKEA founder said, no, I'm going to stay and we're going to repeal that. But I've got a commentary coming out next week just pointing out that if you also want to talk about the fact that a wealth tax is supposed to be just the wealthy paying for it, that's another piece, because our good friends at the Wall Street Journal the other day said, this idea of a wealth tax, Europe's beleaguered middle class knows better. And then talks about the fact that, okay, let's face it, some of these European nations have larger welfare entitlement programs, but they have found all sorts of different ways to add additional taxes. And so, Dr. Merrill Matthews, let me count the ways, see if you can come up with a few more. But first of all, the income tax rates are higher, and the highest marginal rates kick in at a lower level. So you not only pay more, but you pay more earlier than you do in the United States.
Right.
Then you have all sorts of other things. You have the payroll taxes. Well, we have those too, which are over there called social insurance contributions. But those are higher than we pay for Social Security and Medicare. Then in Europe, and every time I've traveled in Europe, I remember we got a VAT tax
You
there.
got a VAT tax. That's a big one.
Tax, which is an average in about 21%. I'm not going to give you every one of the countries here, but 21% kind of in an average. Then we have excise taxes on fuel, and you say, well, we have those too. Oh, theirs is much higher than ours are.
Much higher. When the yellow vest movement recently exploded, they were moving the price of the tax on gasoline up, and if I remember right, it was going to be about $7 a liter then, or no, it worked out about $7 a gallon for gasoline.
Yes,
$7 a gallon.
Yeah, well, and that's
I'd revolt too.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you have in Europe, because you always have to go, okay, so they do liters and they do, of course, euros, so you have to translate all that out. But it turns out to be $7 or in some places $8, because I've been traveling everywhere from Italy to France a little bit, and also Switzerland and in Israel. And I mean, it's just unbelievable what these are paying. And if that's not enough, I love this one. Britain also has a stamp tax. Remember the stamp tax during the 18th century? They got a stamp tax.
It's one of the reasons we aren't Britain.
So anyway, Penna Dexter's commentary today is about the wealth taxes, about how that is being proposed by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and others. And so that's part one. Next week, I have one on middle-class taxes, just simply pointing out that it turns out that even if you do implement a wealth tax, there's just not enough rich people out there, and the taxes end up on the middle class because that's where the money is.
That's where the money is.
Yeah. So anyway, we're going to take a break. Chelsey should join us, and then we'll get into the impeachment inquiry. We'll look at this campaign 2020, and we'll pick up a couple of pieces that we've mentioned but may get into in a little more detail. You can visit our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition, and we are glad you have joined us. And if you'd like to join a little bit later, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to talk about a number of things. Chelsey is with us with the Human Action Coalition. Human Coalition Action. I got them in backwards, and certainly glad to have you here again today to talk about some of these issues.
Yes, happy Friday, Kerby.
And Dr. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, IPI.org. And Dr. Matthews, we've got a lot to talk about today, don't we?
We do. It's a full week.
Especially before we get to the impeachment inquiry, which I know everybody is probably dreading because that's something a lot of people don't even want to talk about, but it's in the news. Let's talk about something that, as Matt Vetsta put it this way, the latest jobs report was not kind to Democrats because we have, again, a record-setting month. Now, Donald Trump just tweeted this morning, great jobs report. And, of course, he's never known for humility. Hyperbole seems to run in his family and certainly with him. But in this case, it's right, because we have 158,593,000 Americans working in November, the 24th record in the Trump presidency. That's pretty good, isn't it?
It's a bunch. And what's happening there is it was a good job report all the way around. So service sectors increased, but also some manufacturing and other elements as well. So that's kind of what they were looking at. So it took everybody by surprise, came out much better than they thought, given all of the headwinds that the economy and both the U.S. and the world economy is facing. So nothing to be ashamed about in that report.
Chelsey, 266,000 new jobs. Non-farm payroll employment rose just in November. That's just incredible.
Wow, that is incredible. You know, the numbers speak for themselves. I think the country as a whole, regardless of what side you're on of the aisle you're on, has so much to celebrate with that going into Christmas and the holidays and ending a year with great numbers. I actually saw an article that J.P. Morgan released using various variables that they said that going back to the presidential election of 1896, Trump as an incumbent benefits from the strongest economic tailwinds on record.
And just amazing.
Almost 150 years, which is incredible.
Let's again mention that these are just preliminary reports, but if you look at the job growth numbers for September and October, in both cases they were revised up. Mm-hmm. So an additional 13,000 jobs in September revised up. 28,000 jobs are revised up in October, so this number may not be the lowest. It may be somewhere in the right range, but again, there may be thousands more jobs that once they get the final totals make this even look better than it looks right now.
So it looks very well. The stock market is up well over 300 points today. There is a narrative going on out there that when the stock market is doing very well, Donald Trump will say something about the negative about the trade deal. And we saw that on Monday or Tuesday this week, and that sort of tanked the stock market because so much of what the stock market, you've got a good economy, the market's reacting to that, but it's also reacting to what they're thinking are positive steps on the trade deal. China has been saying, yeah, we're staying in close contact, things are moving forward. And things are looking positive. So the market really hopes we get this trade deal resolved, at least the first phase one of it, sometime in the near future.
Chelsey, that kind of gets us into a situation that we have in the latest Outlook magazine, because we talk about China, and part of it is the trade deal, because right now we have trade wars. Now, it's a little bit of a lull right now, but nevertheless, these are economic numbers at a time when we really are kind of in a trade war with China, and we're still doing very, very well, aren't we?
Yes, I think it goes to show, we've talked about this a number of times on the show before, that there is a very narrow economic purpose for sanctions and tariffs, even dating back to, Smith as an economist saying that sometimes if it pushes for temporary reason, your allies or foes in the right direction, economically speaking, on the trade, that it can be very beneficial for your country. And I think that, maybe in the beginning of the tariffs, this seemed a little bit out of sorts. Our country had not seen that in a while. People weren't sure how to react. But look, a year later, our economy is booming. We're doing well, and we have reasons to be confident moving forward.
One more issue I want to put on the table is unemployment. Okay, those of us that took Economics 101, we learned that, full employment is not 0%. Full employment, there are just some people that are just either not going to work or don't have the ability to work. So probably full employment's around 4%. Remember that number, because if you look at these numbers right now, the unemployment rate for adult men and women, 3.2%. Now, breaking it down for whites, it's 3.2%. For blacks, it's 5.5%. But even for African Americans or Hispanics, 4.2%. These are the lowest unemployment rates in the last 50 years, lower than economists thought we could get the unemployment rate down in terms of percentage.
And that would be even better if some employers could find workers who were skilled enough to do some of the jobs. The Wall Street Journal was reporting just yesterday or day before yesterday about one of the companies that has several organizations underneath it, but they just simply cannot find the workers that they have that have the skills. They, in some cases, they go out and start training them, but you would see that decline even more if you had the skills base and the job openings that would sort of match a little better right now.
Yes, and again, sometimes you see the help wanted ads. Those of us that are a little old remember when that used to be in the newspapers, but a lot of
What's
them
a
are
newspaper?
a lot of those are for people that have like a PhD in biochemistry and things like that. And so we really do need to get the right kind of people, even in other countries over here, to do some of those jobs, programming and those kinds of things. But while I'm mentioning 3%, Chelsey, I thought I'd mention one more. Wage growth and the GDP has been at or above 3% for 16 consecutive months. I remember a time during the campaign when the current president at that time, Barack Obama, was kidding candidate Donald Trump. What's he going to do, wave a magic wand to get 3% of growth? And that's what's been taking place pretty regularly.
I know that's an incredible number, especially because, one of the major talking points on the left is increasing minimum wage. And it's so funny to me that we have such debate about basic economics because it's a numbers game. And at the end of the day, you have numbers to quantify growth and what is working and what is not. And clearly, the things the Trump administration now are implementing, the conservative principled economics, their laissez-faire, all of that is turning into across the board growth. And we can rectify some of these issues with the lower wage by just allowing a free market to do what it does best.
One of the concerns that Democrats had made for years was wage stagnation. They would say, we haven't had any wage increases in 20 years. We're actually getting it, and that actually helps boost the consumer spending, and the consumer spending is what's actually been driving the economy. Business investment is down some, but consumer spending still holding strong.
Not to mention a number of manufacturing jobs coming back. And again, that was the other one that was supposed to be a magic wand, but they do have some. And you said in furniture, I think I heard you say the other day.
Yes, furniture and some other places it's been coming back. It's struggling in steel now, which is what the steel tariffs were supposed to help. It did initially, but steel now is actually struggling some.
Well, again, if you get an actual trade deal with China and the trade wars end, my goodness, can you imagine what that looks like next year? So we'll see. Well, when we come back, okay, we've got to get to it. The impeachment inquiry. We've been talking about what has happened in the Intelligence Committee. Now, of course, it's in the Judiciary, and so we'll look at that whole issue. And then, of course, the Speaker of the House says they are supposed to write up articles of impeachment. So we'll talk about what that means right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the American creed? That is a question David Gellertner asks in his book, America Light. He has been on my radio program to talk about his book and his op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. He is a fascinating individual. He received 2 degrees in classical Hebrew literature, but then became a professor of computer science at Yale University. Some have called him a rock star in the world of computing. You might remember that he was one of the people who was critically injured when he opened a mail bomb sent by the Unabomber. He believes that we need to return to the principles that made this country great. Unfortunately, he says, many of us don't know what they are or think they can't work. He blames the public schools and the academy for this failure to pass on the basic ideals that have served America so well for centuries. He laments that almost no one believes that our public schools are doing a passable job of teaching American and Western civilization. Textbooks and class lectures in our education system today often start with the assumption that America and Western ideals are bad for civilization. He concludes that many American children have never heard a good word for the United States, the West, Judaism, or Christianity their whole lives. He also laments that our American culture is in the hands of intellectuals, which he says are usually people born with high IQ and low common sense. He gives lots of examples of this. You can probably think of many other examples of people who are very bright but lacking in basic common sense. America's creed is quite simple: freedom, equality, democracy, and America as the promised land. The early founders believed in America as a city on a hill, as did many presidents right up to President Reagan. It is time to use our American creed to evaluate those who are teaching our kids and those who are leading our nation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Over the last couple of weeks, of course, we've had the impeachment inquiry, first of all, in the Intelligence Committee. And, of course, there's a little bit of controversy surfacing now, which we'll come back to in a little bit with Adam Schiff and subpoenaing and getting records for the phone calls of some of the Republican members there on the Intelligence Committee. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But now that has shifted from the Intelligence Committee to the Judiciary Committee. The chairman there is Gerald Nadler, but the ranking chairman on the Republican side is Doug Collins. And one of the things he said in the opening remarks, which I thought were kind of interesting, I'd love to get anybody's comments. This didn't start with Mueller, that's Robert Mueller in the investigation. It didn't start with a phone call back in July. This started with tears in Brooklyn in November 2016 when an election was lost. Any thoughts?
That's absolutely right. And our listeners should remember that by December, Martin Sheen did a video where he had a number of celebrities there saying, you electors, when you go to Washington, don't vote for Trump. We know you're supposed to do that. You've taken a place to do that. Don't do it. It actually started, the sort of a major movement started in December after the election. In January, when they were counting the electors, several of the Democrats started speaking, saying, we got to stop this. We have to stop this. And Joe Biden, then vice president, said, guys, it's over.
Yes, it's over.
Except it wasn't.
It wasn't. And again, I've held this up before. Anybody watching online, 86 things Democrats have said Trump could be impeached for, and this came out in September.
So the number is certainly higher now.
Yeah, well, the last one is extorting a foreign government. So the point is that starting all the way in the very first days of 2017, You had mostly Maxine Waters, but Gerald Nadler, who we're going to talk about in just a minute, Al Green, and all the rest, already making the case for impeachment before anybody had ever heard of who the president of Ukraine was. So this has been ongoing for a long time.
This is so destructive, and I had a piece in the Hill a month or so ago about this. They have lowered the bar for impeachment so low that if a Democrat comes up and wins this election, and if Republicans don't like it, they will start looking. They could conceivably start doing the exact same thing, saying, "Well, their efforts on impeachment sort of got them the election. It's a false election. That person really didn't win." And then you have the same kind of thing going on. It's a very, very bad precedent to start.
I'm going to quote from a couple law professors. I want to hear from our law expert here in just a minute. But one of those is Michael Gerhardt, who was saying just the opposite. He's a law professor at the University of North Carolina School of Law. And he said he was fearful that if we don't impeach Donald Trump, then we would raise the bar so high that we would never have an impeachment in the future. And in just a few minutes, we're going to have some fun because some people have said, because he said, we've never had, what was it, one of his lines here? We have no longer have any obligation because this is the worst conduct of any prior president. And in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about try Andrew Jackson, and we'll tie Lyndon Johnson, Franklin D. Roosevelt. We'll go down the whole long list. But nevertheless, that was the argument said with a straight face that if we don't, we're going to have a monarchy. And then that led to the Stanford University law professor Pamela Karlan, who actually said, we're heading towards a monarchy because, after all, the Constitution says there can be no titles of nobility. So while the president can name his son Baron, he cannot make him a baron, which got Melania Trump really upset about that. Right?
Well, they leave the kids out of it. I mean, that's just, but I think it does go to show how largely discredited the left has become, because we do have an interest as a country in preventing corruption at the highest office level, right? And we do have an interest in ensuring that the president of our country is behaving in a noble and in a way with integrity. And so for them to over 86 times now cry wolf, the country just doesn't buy it anymore. And I do think, I got into some of the legal weeds on this issue because I really wanted to parse out, where the sticking point is, because they have not fundamentally declared this bribery. They have not fundamentally declared it any of the legal basis for high crimes that they could have to actually impeach him. And so I went into the standards for what bribery is under the federal statutes. And the first definition only applies, by the way, to domestic officials. So it wouldn't even apply to foreign officials.
Right.
So then you have to go to the second category, which requires a high level of corruption in the request. And I think that everybody has to put their Department of State hat on, their foreign affairs hat on, and understand that our aid to other countries is always tied. It's always got strings attached. It's always tied to their ability to help us in a certain scenario, or we remove aid for those who will harm us in a certain scenario. And further, we do, as an interest, have a country as a country have an interest in ensuring that our aid does not go to corrupt governments or corrupt entities. And so the fact that he was asking an attorney general of another nation receiving our aid to ensure there was not corruption at that level, I mean, that's a very common ask. Now, we know that he had a personal gain from that, but does that rise to the level of corruption? I am doubtful, and I think that most people who are intellectually honest about what these legal standards really are would agree.
And one of the other people that testified was Nora Feldman, who's the professor at Harvard Law School, who at the time was trying to make the case that it was bribery. But all he simply said is, under our Constitution, it's bribery. Already we got more content from Chelsey than we got from a Harvard law professor.
I was amazed how many liberals who believe in the living Constitution
all of a sudden we're believing in the founders.
Believing in the founders, quoting the founders, identifying. They became originalist overnight. But I thought it was really interesting that the Washington Examiner sent out a note saying more people did a search for Peloton, that's the internet-based bicycle,
which was very controversial, for some people. The one interchange that I thought would be helpful, especially since we had heard from this individual, Michael Gerhardt, who is at North Carolina, was that this is unprecedented. This is worse misconduct than any prior president. So Ken Buck, who is a representative in Colorado, a Republican, when he had the one particular law professor who was at least a little more favorable towards the Trump campaign, and that'd be Jonathan Turley, who is still a Democrat, still voted for Hillary Clinton. You know, he started asking some questions. So Buck asked, first of all, Lyndon Johnson directed the Central Intelligence Agency to place a spy in Barry Goldwater's campaign, who was his election opponent. The spy got advance copies of speeches and other strategies and delivered that to the Johnson campaign. Would that be an impeachable conduct according to these other three panelists? And Jonathan Turley said, yeah, I assume so. How about when President Johnson put a wiretap on Goldwater's campaign plane? Would that be for political benefit? I'm assuming it would, Turley says. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, when he was president, directed the IRS to conduct audits of political enemies. Huey Long, William Randolph Hearst, Hamilton Fish, Father Charles Coughlin. Would that be an abuse of power, according to these other panelists? I pretty much assume it would. How about when President Kennedy directed his brother, that would be the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, to deport one of his mistresses as an East German spy? Would that qualify as an impeachment conduct? Turley said, well, I can't exclude that. How about when Kennedy directed the FBI to use wiretaps on congressional staffers who opposed him politically? Would that be an impeachable conduct? You can see where we're going.
No.
He then takes you to Barack Obama and everybody else. And in a minute, we can even go all the way back to Andrew Jackson. How about presidents that have suspended habeas corpus? That'd be John Adams. That'd be Abraham Lincoln. How about the internment of Japanese individuals in California? Using the criteria of those three other panelists, everything would be impeachment. And Chelsey, that sounds a little bit like what Dr. Merrill Matthews is saying. If we don't stop this train, every president in the future will be impeached for doing something, right?
Well, I think we as a country have to understand what an extraordinary remedy impeachment really is. I mean, we're talking, the basis of our foundation as a democratic society rests on our ability to choose our leader. And for the legislature to remove that chosen leader, that is an extraordinary thing that should not be taken lightly. And I do think the Democrats understand that, because I think they're trying a little bit to get some Republicans on board. But for the most part, under the Nixon impeachment hearings, it was a bipartisan effort after a while. And it required both parties to be on board before they move forward. And I would like the Democrats to seek out that unity and that credibility. They're obviously not. But I do think we need to understand what the really ramifications of this could be.
Yes. And again, we don't have any investigation like a Ken Starr or people like that, Leon Jaworski, I should say. And I don't know. Anyway, we're going to take a break, and then I want to come back and go around the round table and get your thoughts about if they have articles of impeachment. Where do you think the vote goes? What happens when it goes to the Senate, and all sorts of other issues. But if you'd like to join us, you've been watching these impeachment hearings, or maybe not. Matter of fact, we have more people watching the Peloton commercial, perhaps, than that. We'd love to give you that chance to join our conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Then we're going to talk about Campaign 2020. I really want to hear Chelsey's comments about the extreme positions that some of these candidates are taking on abortion. After all, she's with Human Coalition Action, so we'll talk about that right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Chelsey and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. And let's go to California first. Joshua, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hi, thank you for accepting my call. So I know a lot of people, they don't want to see the president get impeached. I actually have a different take on this. To me, it seems that for any meaningful legislation to get done, one party has to really control all three branches. So my take on this is, like, if this impeachment will lead to Republicans regaining control of the House and maybe expand their majority on the Senate to maybe a supermajority, something I don't think Republicans have ever had, I think it is well worth it, and if it will lead to the re-election of the president, because there's so much that needs to be done in the country that I think it would be a worthwhile investment if that would be the outcome.
Well, and there are some people who have suggested that, including the president says, bring it on. It's kind of like, because the argument that has been made even to Nancy Pelosi, and that's why I was surprised the other day that she stood up there for all of 6 minutes, didn't take questions, and said, well, we just are reluctantly going to have to call for articles of impeachment. Dr. Merrill Matthews, she in the past has been really hesitant about that because we, those of us a little bit older around the table, remember what happened to the Republicans after they tried to impeach Bill Clinton.
We do. And she knows that Donald Trump won a number of districts where she has vulnerable Democrats. And that's a continuing story about whether or not those individuals are going to be able to retain that. So if Donald Trump were impeached, you'd have Mike Pence. They might try to start impeachment proceedings against him, but Mike Pence would become the president. And the problems of impeachment aside, if Mike Pence were president, we would be fine as a country, I think. So. Even though I wouldn't wish impeachment on anyone, if that happened, I don't think it's going to happen. But if it did, we'd have Mike Pence as president, and I think we'd be doing fine then.
Yeah. Again, just think about the impact that this would have, Chelsey, for those individuals in those so-called red districts where you're a Democrat and you have to then try to explain to your voters, many of whom voted for Donald Trump, that you actually voted to impeach the man.
Well, I think they're already facing those questions. I don't think a full impeachment has to occur before we have those types of outcomes, because I think the country's already exhausted from this. They're already agitated by this. I think the Democrats have lost a lot of credibility. So frankly, if they were worried about their seats, they should have thought about that before now, because that train has left the station. But I get back to just those constitutional principles that regardless of party in power, regardless of politics, you have to take impeachment very, very seriously. It truly is messing with our democratic process. And so I would never want to utilize that for political gain for either side.
Right. And again, talk about how angry we are. Jonathan Turley the other day said, I get it. You're mad. The president is mad. My Democratic friends are mad. My Republican friends are mad. My wife is mad. My kids are mad. Even my dog is mad. And Luna is a golden doodle, and she is never mad. So.
Yes. It was a great line. I was talking to a chief of staff here earlier this week who told me that they had gotten a note from Steny Hoyer on the Democratic side saying, we're supposed to be out on the 12th of December, but keep the next week open because we may be back. And he was sort of speculating, the chief of staff, that if they end up going home on the 12th and they call it quits for then and say, we're going to come back and look at this in February, that he thinks that's going to be a sign that they're thinking this is going to be too much trouble for us. We're going to kind of postpone it. We'll come back in January, and then we'll say we need to do a little more investigation. He thinks that's an indication that they're actually having second thoughts and going to pull it back. However, I also have heard that Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, is leaving the schedule completely open in January so that they can take it up if they have to.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute, because I did bring that up. Okay, articles of impeachment might be drafted. Now they have to be voted on, but let's assume that even next week they vote on them. Or they wait till January to vote on them. That makes it worse, because then if indeed you get enough votes, it's possible that you could, then it goes to the Senate. What happens? Well, the Senate has to sit as jurors. Now, that is really bad news for a few senators: Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker. Would have been bad for Kamala Harris, but she dropped off. But, these are senators who would have to sit there without going out there and recognize the first Iowa caucus is what? February 3rd. So that's a disaster. More to the point that something I know, Chelsey, you and your former employers at First Liberty were concerned about. If the Senate is sitting there, they don't really have an opportunity to confirm some of those federal judges. Now, what I've heard is that they would have the, if you will, trial for impeachment in the morning, and then they would go and confirm those judicial appointments in the afternoon. But it would just gum up everything because the Chief Justice of the United States has to sit there as the judge. And so it would slow down the Supreme Court. It would slow down the judicial nominations, and it would just completely ruin any possibility of passing any meaningful legislation, wouldn't it?
Right. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars. And to be clear that this would be like a full trial so that our listeners understand that this is treated as a jury where they present live evidence, and it is the Senate's job to serve as a trial, full trial against the president. So there would be, prosecutor, and, he'd raise a defense. And it's a lot to frankly put our country through at a time where the Democrat Party is having an identity crisis, much like we had after President Obama won, where they're deciding, who are we? What are we going to look like when all of this is over and the dust settles? And their primary is frankly the time for them to be figuring that out. And so, yes, I view it as detrimental to their own party to take away from that.
And the problem here is there doesn't seem to be a real path to victory in the Senate. Democrats you'd have to get every Democrat voting for impeachment and I think roughly 19 Republicans. And so the media keeps saying, well, maybe Romney would, maybe Susan Collins would. They keep identifying 2 or 3 that might vote for impeachment. But that's assuming all Democrats. Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, might very well vote to impose impeachment. So it doesn't seem like this is going to work out to be a victory for them. So at that point, you have to wonder, why are you going forward with this? If you know it's going to lose in the Senate, you'll be able to say the president was impeached, but he's still in office and you haven't actually achieved anything.
Let's take some more phone calls, and we'll go to Missouri this time. Jackie, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, thank you all for the program. It's so hard to find news anymore that you can really rely on the truth.
I agree with that.
I appreciate that. And for all the reasons that have already been mentioned on the program today, as well as others that have been mentioned, I just as an American citizen, am very frustrated by the entire process. Not only the waste of time that it is creating for those that we wish would be working on other issues that would affect our country positively, but also just the waste of funds to go toward this impeachment hearing. So my question for you is, what can we as individual American citizens that are frustrated by this process, what can we do to speak up or speak out? And is there any power that we have to maybe bring an end to this process?
Very good question.
It is a good question.
And first of all, we have kind of our take action item at the moment. It was to express your opinion about Lawrence Van Dyke and his confirmation, but we're probably going to put one up there pretty soon about just contacting your members of Congress, either those in the House or those in the Senate, about some of these issues. Of course, your members of the United States Senate, we just quoted Josh Hawley earlier in the week, probably are on the right path. But I think there is a time, what did you think, to say, don't we have a treaty between Mexico and Canada and the United States? Don't we have the possibility that the federal government's going to run out of money December 20th? Don't we have a few other issues that are a little more pressing? Isn't that something we could say to some of these members of Congress?
Absolutely. I mean, letting them know what our real priorities for them are is very important as their constituents. And many of the members I talk to, even at the state level, they really do listen to their constituents and take them seriously and want to address their concerns. But the other thing I would say is voting. I mean, we have to turn out to vote, and that is your chance to really let your elected officials know if they're doing the right job or not. And I do think every vote matters. I do think getting out and having your family members vote and reminding them where their polling locations are. I mean, this is going to be a very, very important election for our country.
I know right now everybody's thinking about Christmas, the number of shopping days before Christmas, but we only have a few days before. First of all, you actually have on February 3rd, the first Iowa caucus. And then, of course, you have New Hampshire, you have South Carolina, you have Nevada. March 3rd, you have 12 now primaries, Texas, including Texas and California. California never was in that. A few days later, you have Louisiana. Then you have the second Super Tuesday on March 10th. You have 8 more then. And so in some respects, you're going to have an opportunity a lot faster than you realize to actually make a difference, because that, in many cases, is going to be where the real battle is going to be taking place in terms of the primaries. And if you've got a member of Congress that has been part of this do-nothing Congress, as Gary Bauer said, I've seen do-nothing Congresses in the past. This Congress has given those a bad name. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Candidates on the far left are proposing to tax the rich big time. They need revenue to fund their massive spending plans and also want to deliver their version of economic justice to the country. Senator Elizabeth Warren says, "We want to build an America that works for the people, not one that just works for rich folks." She has unveiled tax proposals that, added together, would push federal tax rates for some multimillionaires and billionaires above 100%. Senator Bernie Sanders wants an annual tax of 1 to 8% on the wealth of joint filers whose assets are valued at $32 million or above. Columnist Megan McArdle of The Washington Post finds it strange that Senator Warren is so appealing to affluent voters. She points out that there is one thing a wealth tax can do better than anything else: destroy fortunes. Both Senators Warren and Sanders ignore the fact that Europe has tried wealth taxes and mostly rejected them because they didn't work. Sweden's 70s-era wealth tax was relatively small, but still drove out some of the country's brightest citizens, like IKEA founder Ingvar Kamprad, before the country repealed it. Germany had a 0.5 to 0.7% tax on personal and corporate wealth for nearly 2 decades before dropping it. Some on the left want to reimpose it, but studies show this would shrink gross domestic product by 5% and employment by 2%. Some 70,000 millionaires have left France since 2000 because of its wealth tax. Of the 12 European countries that had wealth taxes in 1990, only 3 have them today. The revenue raised just wasn't worth the administrative burden or the damage to the economy and the jobs picture. The wealth tax is immoral. It's a confiscatory tax on assets accumulated from work, thrift, and investment that have already been taxed once. The Wall Street Journal calls it the ultimate populist envy tax. We must avoid it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and let me just, if we can, as we are going around the round table with Merrill Matthews and Chelsey, to spend some time talking about Campaign 2020, because we've just been alluding to that. Penna Dexter's commentary today, which we just heard if you were listening online, on wealth taxes, is something we will maybe get to in the next hour. And I have a commentary coming out next week pointing out that if you think that we just only need to tax the rich, the people, I love the way the Wall Street Journal put it, Europe's beleaguered middle class knows better. So we'll get into some of that. But before we get into that issue, let's take on the issue of abortion, because that's the second article we've posted. This particular one is 2020 Democrats expose extreme abortion policies in new survey. Now, I know, Chelsey, that you at the Human Coalition Action have been looking at the pro-life issue for some time. And interestingly enough, the New York Times, you got to love them, put together a set of questions for the Democratic presidential candidates. And we'll get into the details, but the 20,000-foot view is that except for a man that no longer is running for the primary, that's Joe Stasek, you really can't find another individual in the Democratic Party that would believe that any regulation at any part of pregnancy is justifiable. And you have to come back, the two old guys around the table. Remember when Bill Clinton used to say, safe, legal, and rare. And he would say rare. He would overemphasize rare. Amy Klobuchar sometimes will use that phrase. Tulsi Gabbard sometimes, not very often. And so, Chelsey, this is the most extreme abortion mindset on the part of all the Democratic presidential candidates that at least the two guys around the table have ever seen before.
Yes, I mean, it is common for parties during the primaries to really try to pander towards their bases and find the more polarizing of the views are more forefront. Unfortunately, in this arena, the country is not aligned with this platform, even among the Democrats. I mean, the views that they're advocating for are extreme and border on infanticide. And the country knows that and recognizes that, and I think is very off-put by that. I always say follow the money. So you have to remember who has the biggest now advocacy arm in the abortion movement. Planned Parenthood. And they are pouring millions and millions and millions into these races. They're providing these members with messaging and talking points. That came out I believe it was the Virginia governor who really blundered his interviews talking about how extreme his abortion views were. It came out later that Planned Parenthood gave him those talking points. And so let's not think for a minute that these candidates are really thinking for themselves on these issues. They're regurgitating talking points they're getting paid to say, frankly. And the frustrating part about that is it is not in step with the American people. I want Americans to be paying attention to this because, you know, among the Black population, for instance, a great article I would encourage all of our listeners to go read. It came out in the Washington Examiner discussing my executive director, Reverend Dean Nelson, and Timothy Head drafted it, talking about the Church of God in Christ, which is the biggest denomination, Black denomination in the entire country. Millions and millions members of that have officially created a platform that say they are pro-life. That is significant because half of our Black population is missing because of abortion. Half. I mean, that's devastating to hear. And I think that there's an awakening in our country that's understanding really the impact, even from a eugenics standpoint, that has been successful in the abortion industry in our country. Right now in New York, you are more likely to be aborted if you're a Black child than you are to be born alive. And that's really devastating statistics. I think people are starting to understand this. There's a humanizing happening, rightfully so, with preborn children, understanding now with sonograms and medicine that they can feel pain at a certain, you know, my baby right now, I am 15 weeks pregnant, has fingerprints. 15 weeks, and just understanding more and more about these preborn children. I think our country is really coming along. And so I hope that that is a big, big platform that we as voters care about and show up to the polls about in the upcoming election.
So again, just some very important facts and figures we need to hear about.
And to her point on Blacks, I think I saw an article this week that I think Rasmussen polling and another one had significant support from Blacks for President Trump. I think it was like a figure of 34% or something. Which is
Emerson and Rasmussen and one other. Now there's three that all come with it 34%.
Significantly higher than they typically are. And if that ends up being accurate and that holds, the election's over.
It's over. Well, and again, Hillary Clinton got 88% of the African American vote and lost. So if you, again, 34% approve of the president doesn't mean 34% will vote for the president.
Right.
But if even half of those do, it just, again, and part of that is this issue of abortion, because if you go to most of the individuals in the African-American community, and again, I want to hear from our African-American listeners because I don't want to speak for them. I want you to speak, clarify that if it's wrong, but many of them tend to be pretty much pro-life and be really disturbed about the fact that a lot of these Planned Parenthood clinics are in their neighborhood, and they want an alternative to that.
That's absolutely true. And if I could just say one thing to our listeners that they walk away from, it is that this should be your number one issue to vote on. It is one of the only issues you can vote on that lives are at stake for. Like, genuinely, people will die if you do not vote correctly on this issue. And the moral implications of that in our society are grand. And I don't think we as voters, I've been a little bit surprised as I've joined the pro-life movement, how many Christians and how many conservatives and even churches I talk to say, well, this is important, but it's not our main issue. Well, this is important, but it's not the main thing. And it absolutely should be. The moral implications of this are people, the innocent are dying, and it is on us to stand in the gap for them. And I just want to encourage all of our listeners to really take that to heart. And yes, the economy matters. Yes, the judges matter. Yes, all these other issues, they do matter. But this truly is an issue of life or death. And this should be your number one moral issue you're voting based on.
You know, I never thought I would hear myself say this, but Kanye West
yes,
has become such a vocal spokesperson for Christianity. I haven't heard where he is on abortion yet.
He came out on abortion with this recently, actually. Yes, he absolutely recognizes, the terrible impact this has had on the Black community.
You take a spokesperson like that who has both a Christian testimony and a pro-Trump testimony, he could have a huge impact on the Black vote. Whether you support Trump or not, he could have a huge impact on the Black vote if he continues being vocal and out there discussing his support for that.
Well, again, I want to get your comments on that because we put a few things on the table. We'll come back. We have a lot more to say. 1-800-351-1212. But this article, first of all, I think is very helpful because the survey was done by the New York Times. So in some respects, they probably were a little more honest with a reporter from the New York Times. And by being honest, it's just it's amazing because, again, as the two old guys around the table, I remember when it used to be the argument from Democrats is the pro-life position is such an extreme position. Mm-hmm. And first of all, the country is about 50-50. Yeah. But even people that are pro-choice have a real problem with third trimester abortions, abortion right up to birth. And so, if anything, the really extreme
in some cases
party,
after birth.
Yeah.
We were talking about that not long ago.
Yeah. So again, the Democrat Party and these Democratic candidates are looking to be extreme in a way that really has changed the dynamic. And back to what Chelsey said, this is the issue. Frankly, if you say, well, I want to look at a lot of issues, usually if you're wrong on life, you're wrong on a whole bunch of other issues anyway. Mm-hmm. I've looked at enough voting guides over the years to know that tell me how you stand on the issue of life. And if you're pro-life, that doesn't necessarily mean all your other issues will be necessarily good. But if you're pro-choice, pro-abortion, you're probably wrong on lots of other issues as well. So let's take a break, and we'll get your comments. Maybe you have some thoughts about Campaign 2020 and about some of the candidates. And when we come back, we'll get into some of the other issues besides abortion, because the candidates are talking about Medicare for all and drug price controls and all sorts of things that we're going to try to give you some answers for. All that coming up right after these important messages.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time again talking about this issue of abortion, but move on to some of these medical issues as well. One of the articles we've posted by Derek Hunter, drug price controls are a bad idea with lots of support. You hear all sorts of Democratic candidates talking about that. And also, I thought I might add to this something that came out just the other day, all these sort of medical miracles, all these drugs that have been developed that are just making our lives so much better. Dr. Merrill Matthews, we have a piece there as well, an easy way to cut $640 billion from the federal budget. The word easy is in quotes. We'll get into some of those. But Chelsey, let me come back to you for just a minute, because you said something in passing. I'd like to hear it a little bit more, that sometimes people don't see this abortion issue as a major issue. And yet, if you look at the polls, most Americans identify themselves as either pro-life or pro-choice. But if you start talking about after maybe viability, even the pro-choicers start saying, yeah, I think we shouldn't allow abortion in that regard. So if anything, the stance being held right now by the Democratic Party is very extreme. And if that's kind of your big issue, that should be sort of a runaway situation in which any pro-life candidate should win re-election or win election, right?
Right. And if it is not your major issue, it should be, which is my argument. I mean, abortion is the leading cause of death in America. It beats cancer, it beats heart disease, it beats all of the ailments combined that you can think of. 1 in 3 pregnancies end in death. And our sustainability as a country rests on protecting life and protecting the innocent. And, you know, I heard kind of this metaphor that I thought was a great way to put this in perspective, because sometimes I'll meet with churches, or I'll meet, you know, with conservative groups or people who they're like, yes, this is important. I understand, but it's just not our major issue. We're trying to work on homelessness. We're working on, you know, premarital. We're pulled in all these different directions. And your donor dollars, you're asked to give 100 ways to Sunday, right? Where does it go? And how do we prioritize these issues? And I heard if you're standing on a corner, and on one corner is a homeless man who's hungry, and on another corner is a couple that's fighting, and on another corner is a child being murdered, which corner do you run to? And I think that's a really simple example that this is that important. And when nobody really likes to talk about abortion, I think it is an ugly topic. It's a hard topic to discuss. I think it's an intimidating one. We don't know how to talk about it. When you really think about empowering women to parent and empowering women to do what God created them to do is a beautiful thing and a good thing and not a shameful thing, that is feminism. Learning how to talk about these issues, I think, can equip people to be more confident in their approach. But at the end of the day, when you get into the nuts and bolts of this is about killing human beings. And we have to acknowledge that as a people. And you can say, well, it's justified in these scenarios, maybe, or, you know, like the pro-choice side likes to do. But at the end of the day, you have to get down to the basic truth and deal with it on its terms in your own personal conscience and say, why is this not more important to me? Or maybe it is very important and you spent your life dedicated to these issues, but the goal being to put this at the front and center of your activity list. And where am I donating my time? Where am I donating my money? And I'm going to vote based on this issue, because it does matter, and lives really will be lost if we don't prioritize it.
I might say, too, that if you say, I really don't know how to make the case for that, Earlier this week, we had Greg Kokel, his book, Tactics, 50th Anniversary, has a whole section there, in addition to how you can use that to present the gospel and deal with objections people have for Christianity. But he did some stuff on pro-life. We had Don Blythe earlier in the week as well talking about this. So we do have resources. So if you're looking for answers or how to make the case, that is certainly it. And
or
so,
even go to humancoalition.action.org because HUCO Action, we have messaging team. We'll help you work through these issues. And we also have a blog at Human Coalition, which is our service provider. They're serving women and children every single day in these situations, facing these decisions. And our president is super passionate about kind of the apologetics of this and how do we talk about this and why not is it wrong. So go to our blog and just peruse it. He has great topics for these issues.
Again, humancoalition.org, and we have that link there. Every child deserves a gift of life, and since I got Dr. Merrill Matthews here, IPI.org for Institute of Policy Innovation. And since we're talking about kind of the medical issues, let me pick up one of the other articles. This one is by Derek Hunter. And again, you just hear this all the time from some of these Democratic candidates that we need drug price controls, which, according to Derek Hunter, is a bad idea with lots of support because it's easy to demonize an industry that is faceless, has a lot of money. But if you start telling the drug manufacturers what they can and cannot produce and the price that they have to produce it at, which is the bill by Nancy Pelosi, you're not going to get these innovative drugs that are saving lives, right?
No, because you politicize the diseases that the drug companies would go after. So the politics of people who are the chairman of the committee, if this is the biggest issue for the chairman, then the chairman makes sure the drug companies don't get the money to sponsor this unless they focus on what the chairman finds to be the most important issue. So yes, you politicize it, and that's one of the things that happens in every one of the countries that have a single payer system. Healthcare is politicized, and understandably, if the government determines how much they're going to give you, that money has to compete with education, with Social Security, with welfare, defense, the judicial system, crime, and everything else. There's never enough money to go around. And for our listeners, this is a debate in England right now.
Yes,
Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, both running for prime minister, are having this debate right now. They're talking about how much more money they're going to have to put in the National Health Service, and they have actually been talking about how bad the National Health Service is. If you listen to Bernie Sanders, he'll say Canada and England they provide coverage for everybody for half the money. Well, in England and Canada, they're talking about we don't have enough money in the system to pay for everybody that we're trying to cover because we've made these obligations and we don't fund it well enough.
This article, which people can read, talks about the fact that it costs more than $1 billion. I think you've calculated $1.6 billion.
1.7 billion, and that's hard numbers. That's not fake numbers. That's how much money they spend on R&D divided by the number of drugs that get approved.
And so, again, if you're producing it for 1 million people that have that disease, then you can amortize it over 1 million people. But if indeed you only have people now, some of these drugs are only for diseases only strike maybe 20,000 people. If you do your math, take 1.6 billion and divide by 20,000, you can kind of do the math, right?
Novartis came out with Gelsma the other day. That is for floppy baby syndrome. The babies die usually within 9 months if they have that. It costs $2 million to get this treatment, but it generally cures them.
Yes. When we come back from the break, Jim Garrity gave us a list. I'll only give you maybe a few of the top 10 remarkable drugs that have been produced that are actually just, again, almost like medical miracles. And so, again, it is easy to vilify and demonize the big pharma, and there are some abuses there, which we can come back and talk about sometimes where they try to buy off other companies and things like that. But at the same time, we oftentimes are the beneficiaries of tremendous medical advances. I'll mention a few of those before we get into maybe some other ways to cut the federal budget. So we got a lot of issues that we've posted on the website, so go to pointofview.net. You can find those articles, and we'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What is the American creed? That is a question David Galertner asks in his book, America Light. He has been on my radio program to talk about his book and his op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. He is a fascinating individual. He received 2 degrees in classical Hebrew literature, but then became a professor of computer science at Yale University. Some have called him a rock star in the world of computing. You might remember that he was one of the people who was critically injured when he opened a mail bomb sent by the Unabomber. He believes that we need to return to the principles that made this country great. Unfortunately, he says, many of us don't know what they are or think they can't work. He blames the public schools and the academy for this failure to pass on the basic ideals that have served America so well for centuries. He laments that almost no one believes that our public schools are doing a passable job of teaching American and Western civilization. Textbooks and class lectures in our education system today often start with the assumption that America and Western ideals are bad for civilization. He concludes that many American children have never heard a good word for the United States, the West, Judaism, or Christianity their whole lives. He also laments that our American culture is in the hands of intellectuals, which he says are usually people born with high IQ and low common sense. He gives lots of examples of this. You can probably think of many other examples of people who are very bright but lacking in basic common sense. America's creed is quite simple: freedom, equality, democracy, and America as the promised land. The early founders believed in America as a city on a hill, as did many presidents right up to President Reagan. It is time to use our American creed to evaluate those who are teaching our kids and those who are leading our nation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the things you're going to hear in the debate that will be taking place this month, which, by the way, is 6 days before Christmas. I don't know how many people are going to be watching the Democrat debate, but nevertheless, those that will be arguing for drug price controls. Sounds real good until you recognize the long-term implications. And before we get back to that, I thought, Jim Garrity the other day, for some reason, I'm not sure why he did, he just wanted to talk about some of these breathtaking advances, and most of them that I've got in my sheet here are medical. I'll just give you a couple. A new blood test that could detect breast cancer 5 years before other clinical signs manifest themselves. A new 3-drug combination therapy that could provide significant help to up to 90% of those with cystic fibrosis. A bill that can prevent heart attacks in high-risk patients. That's from the drug maker Amarin. 4 Israeli researchers think they've discovered a molecule which originally was designed to help stroke victims, which may be a way to completely wipe out pancreatic cancer. How many of my friends who are no longer alive died of pancreatic cancer? The Mayo Clinic have injected stem cells derived from fat cells from paralyzed patient's spine. That patient is now walking. A new vaccine to eliminate allergies to cats. Okay, I got to throw that one in there just to get everybody smiling for a minute. UC San Francisco research has managed to transform human stem cells into mature insulin-producing cells, which would be a great cure now for type 1 diabetes. Well, the list goes on and on, from HIV, DNA studies, treatments for Ebola, and just on and on. And so while there are some real abuses from big pharma, got that, and we can even talk about those in a minute, let's not forget the remarkable, almost miraculous cures and treatments and cures that are coming from the kind of research
and
going on
most of what
right
you
now.
mentioned there didn't actually mention gene therapy.
No.
Where they use a machine called CRISPR. They go in there, they
Mhm.
clip out a section of a gene, insert a new section in there, which offsets or sometimes removes or does various things to basically cure a disease permanently because they've changed the genetic makeup there and inserted the proper genes or turned off the bad genes. This is amazing stuff. It's going to be very expensive, but we want them doing this. We don't want to prohibit them from moving forward with these kinds of therapies because they're just amazing. I mean, just imagine, Pfizer for years worked on Alzheimer's. They eventually got to the point they spent billions of dollars. That billions of dollars came from other drugs that are out on the market that were successful that they could transfer over to do Alzheimer's. They eventually came to the place that we're just not having any success, and they moved on. Lilly stepped up and said, "We're still working on Alzheimer's." Just imagine if you can find a cure for Alzheimer's. We want them finding these cures.
Yes. And again, Derek Hunter makes the case that if the United States goes the way of the rest of the world, then expect the results from the way of the rest of the world. Because let's just be honest, Dr. Merrill Matthews, for just a minute. Yes, there are some advances that have come from France and from Germany. We just mentioned Israel, for sure. Just amazing what's going on in Israel right now. But most of these advances are happening in the United States because there's a free market and there's still an incentive. And if some of the pieces of legislation being proposed right now actually get implemented because one of these Democratic candidates wins and they were able to control the House of Representatives and the Senate, it would just pretty much kill the golden goose, wouldn't it?
It would be imposed. They want to impose essentially price controls on drugs. If you're a drug manufacturer and you know you can't get the return that you need for this very expensive drug, you don't do it and you move on to other things. So that's exactly the problem that we're facing. It's not fair, but the U.S. patients end up subsidizing the rest of the world in order to be able to pay for these drugs that are cured, and then the drugs go out. And in many cases, the drug companies go to low-income areas. They allow them to have for much less money, so we're subsidizing that also. That doesn't seem fair, but you don't get them unless we do it.
Yes. Well, and Chelsey, one of the interesting things is if you look at all the Democratic candidates we mentioned just a minute ago, they all are pro-abortion, but they are divided on whether they support Medicare for all or don't support Medicare for all. But to a person, they all talk about this idea of drug price controls, which is one of the right reasons I brought that up. Because if you don't hear the other side and just hear them ranting and raving about that, and you're upset because you hear some story about somebody having to pay a lot of money for drugs, and I understand that. I'm not minimizing that at all. It's easy to go, yeah, let's join the bandwagon here. But once you get rid of the kind of research and development that give us those wonder drugs, they're not coming back, are they?
I know, that's right. You know, I'll say something that you will rarely hear from an attorney, which is, there's a lot I don't know about this. And I am just so fascinated. I'm so grateful for your time today to help explain this to not only me, but our listeners, because there's so much I need to do to be more educated on these issues. For me, it's a little bit, I hear, insurance and premiums, and I do get a little bit lost sometimes in the weeds, but I will say at just a very high level, two things. First, it is a basic principle that when the federal government gets involved, things do not become cheaper or easier. I mean, we have seen this time and time again. You even look at Obamacare and the failure that has been at a high level, although a little bit unrelated, somewhat related. When the federal government gets involved, our premiums go up, our choices go down, things become more cumbersome in the system. And it's just overall a lot less efficient than just leaving it to the free market. And so even though I can't say I understand near as much as you guys do about this, I can say that I have seen the ramifications in my own lifetime of the federal government getting too involved in being our dad in the system instead of allowing humans to make their own choices that are best for their families.
One of the things that the left is saying is that the federal government funds a lot of this research, and so taxpayers are paying for it, so it shouldn't cost as much. What the federal government does through the National Institutes of Health and other places is they they do some very, very basic research as they may be looking at molecules or other things. They are not there to commercialize the thing. They may come up with something, they say, this looks promising, and then the for-profit drug companies come in and they'll take that molecule or that information and they'll begin the testing to try to move it through the process. The process to move a drug from what I call inception to ingestion takes them 10 to 12 years to get it done. From the beginning of it, they move it through computer models and so forth, and they finally try to come up with something they feel like can work. Then they go through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. Clinical trials. For the bigger trials, they may have 15, 20 different academic medical centers that will try to do this on, say, 100 different patients, 150 different patients. So you've got nurses, doctors, academic medical centers all going through this process as they try to come up with the information that the Food and Drug Administration needs to be able to approve or not approve a drug. Last year, I believe we had the most of drugs approved in a given year that we've ever had, which is why the figure went down from $1.7 billion per approved drug to about $1.6 billion, because when I added the latest year in there, you got a few more approved drugs, so it dropped the number a little bit. But the companies are on a mission to try to find solutions to these things, and we don't want to hinder that.
And I might just mention that you mentioned in passing CRISPR, and a lot of people, what's that? Well, if you've listened to the conversation we had last week with Michael Gillian, who was the ABC News science reporter, or a conversation I've had in the past with Dr. Jim Dennison, who, by the way, will be on next Thursday, and we'll be talking about that again. This is the way that you can go into the DNA and pull out particular genes and mix and match genetic material and create things that are medically important substances, some of which, as I just pointed out a minute ago, not only treat the disease, but now we're talking about maybe curing some of those diseases. If you add that to stem cell research, moral stem cell research, not destroying embryos, not the kind of things that are similar to abortion, but using adult stem cells, because they even point out that I can take stem cells from my fat cells, which I think is a win-win. You lose your fat cell, and you actually then can use that. You won't have any kind of reaction, any kind of rejection. These are very powerful tools that are fairly expensive, but again, just bring us into this kind of 21st century world of medicine.
Remember, not too long ago, we were talking about liberals saying we have to have these abortions to get the stem cells.
Yeah.
We are increasingly able to go in and get the stem cells from individuals and from cord blood and other things of that nature, where you don't have to do abortion. So, and we had this discussion. This is 7-8 years ago. I said, in another year or two, we're going to be past that. Actually, took a little longer than that, but we're getting past that. That's no longer an argument for abortion anymore.
Yeah. Embryonic stem cell research, first of all, was not necessary. We found out it never worked because you can't control the genes. They just go all over the place, and you get these teratomas and things like that. So to use adult stem cells to not raise any of the pro-life concerns, and they're much more effective, and it's just becoming kind of like a wonder drug. Well, when we come back, let's get back to some economic issues. Issue number 1, how can the federal government cut $640 billion fairly easily? Dr. Merrill Matthews' piece is on that. And, of course, Penna Dexter's commentary today is about wealth taxes, and my commentary next week is about how when you think you're only going to be able to soak the rich, the people in Europe know better. So we'll come back and talk about some of those economic issues right after these important messages. Stay tuned.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? 2 big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the articles we've posted here is by our Dr. Merrill Matthews, an easy way, easy put in quotes, way to cut $640 billion from the federal budget. And the way to understand this for everybody around the table and even listening is that we take a lot of tax dollars and send it to Washington, D.C., and then just a fraction of that trickles back to the states. And if indeed that is happening, you suggest, Dr. Merrill Matthews, that it's easy, at least in terms of mechanics, of how to cut $639 billion from the federal budget.
It's a good question, Kerby. Why do we send all that tax money to the federal government to have members of Congress and bureaucrats turn around and say, if you do what we want, we will give you some of that money back? Because there's always strings attached to that money. So the proposal I'm suggesting is just lower the tax rates. Don't send that money. Leave it in the states. Now, some states might need to raise their taxes there if they want to use that money, because that money comes back for a range of different things: education, infrastructure, health care, Medicaid, other things of that nature. But there's no point in sending it to Washington, have it run it through their mill, have them take their portion of that,
which is substantial,
yes, and then give us a portion of it back. Just send what would be used for federal purposes as opposed to state purposes to Washington, our taxes. We'd get lower taxes at the federal level, might have higher state taxes, but at least we wouldn't be running it through Washington. And if states want to spend money on this or that or the other, that's fine. That's their opportunity. But I wouldn't have to be funding projects in other states.
That's right. And Chelsey, one of those is welfare. And the last time we talked about this, and it goes back a number of years, individual that actually works at World Magazine, Marvin Olasky, who wrote a very good book that was so influential in the life of, a number of individuals, but Newt Gingrich and others, in terms of welfare reform, said that at that time when he was doing the numbers, for every dollar that we sent to the federal government, which would then trickle back for welfare, we get about 25 cents on the dollar. And that's a heavy carrying cost, administrative overhead, which, as Dr. Merrill Matthews' suggestion, if we keep the money here, we can address education, health care. How about bridges? I'd rather have Texans build Texas bridges and Californians build California bridges or dams.
Remember the bridge to nowhere?
Yes,
in
and
Alaska?
all those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And that makes a whole lot more sense. What do you about
It does,
that?
and we've already seen this work on a micro level. We all remember when Governor Perry out of Texas said, no thank you to federal Obamacare dollars, and we're not going to participate in that. We'll be fined as a state for not participating in that. But we reaped benefits in our economy, and the Texas economy overall, not just because of that, has been booming. Corporations are coming here, and I think that keeping, localized solutions for local problems using local dollars, that just makes good common sense.
Let's get to that issue of Medicaid for just a minute, because as you talk about in this article here, the original idea was the federal government would cover 90%, then they would drop it down to first 100%, then 90%. I remember somebody making the statement that the government can't afford the 90% and we can't afford the 10%, right?
Yes. Paxton at the time, before he became Attorney General, was speaking to a group that I was with, and he said we can't afford the 10%, and the federal government darn sure can't afford the 90%. And he was right about that. Medicaid spending has exploded since then. It's gone up significantly. But the people in the states that have not expanded still keep putting pressure on those states to try to force them to expand. And you've had over time, we had about half the states expand initially, but since that time, another state's come in, another state's come in, another state's come in. So they're gradually expanding this, and at some point, if we don't change it, we'll have just about all the states in there. Things like 31 states now have expanded, so it's moving on that direction.
And Chelsey, one of the reasons why this probably won't happen is because politicians and government bureaucrats like the power, right?
Yes, for whatever reason, they seem drawn to it. But yeah, we've seen a lot of stagnation come out of DC, and we've over the years, it's a major talking point. Obviously, drain the swamp. We've all heard it, but this is part and parcel of that same that same line and train of thought that is it really better if we hand over to the federal government the reins for everything in our lives? And the answer just continues to be no.
Yes. Well, again, I wanted you to see that article because it's something that you might want to look at. And some people, as a matter of fact, earlier said, well, what can we do about this? Well, you could take this article by Dr. Merrill Matthews and go to your legislator. There are going to be some town hall meetings. I understand they are going to have another Christmas recess, and maybe some of them have town hall meetings and say, why do we keep sending money to the federal government so then a very small portion of it trickles back to our state, when we could just keep the money here or just raise the taxes and lower the cost of the federal government? So it's a really good question to ask.
And it's a huge portion of the state budget. Right now, it runs about a third of the state budgets is the federal money coming back to the states. So the states might very well want to keep that because they would like to have that money come back to the states, but nothing prohibits the states from raising the taxes necessary to do it. But at least that point, the people who are benefiting from what the state's doing are paying for it.
Well, we don't have Penna Dexter here, but I'll represent her commentary for just a minute because it's the wealth taxes. And she says, candidates on the far left, which are mostly the ones right now running for the presidency, want to tax the rich. And the argument is that if we just tax the rich like Europe does, then we would be able to afford a welfare and entitlement program like Europe does. And I love the way the Wall Street Journal put it the other day. Europe's beleaguered middle class knows better. But in her piece here, she talks about the fact that when we've looked at the attempt to raise taxes, and some of those are anywhere from an annual tax of 1% to 8% in addition to the wealthy and those kinds of things, you've got some experiments that have been going on in Sweden. If you remember Pippi Longstocking, it turns out that the author there was actually paying, I think it was 130% of her taxable income because of the way that was. And so a lot of people in Sweden just took off. But the founder of IKEA said, I'm not taking off. We're going to get rid of that high tax. And so in some respects, right now, we have these candidates proposing something that was tried in Europe and has basically been withdrawn in almost every country, hasn't it?
And ironically, some of the people who are supporting this we've got two billionaires in the Democratic primary who want a wealth tax. And then Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden have all done very well over the years. Mm-hmm. They're quite wealthy. They're not fabulously wealthy like Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg, but they are quite wealthy, and they're supporting that tax. It's just, it's amazing.
Well, and again, 70,000 millionaires have left France alone, as she points out in the column. But let's talk about then the middle-class taxes. This is my commentary coming out next week, and that is that it isn't enough just to have a wealth tax. So what Europe has done is, first of all, they also have very high income tax rates, which kick in at a much lower, higher marginal rate. But that's not enough. So then they have payroll taxes for social insurance contributions. And of course, we do have Social Security and Medicare taxes, but the ones in Europe are much higher. But that's not enough. So then they have what is called a VAT tax, a value added tax, which in Europe is around about 21%. Then they have excise taxes on fuel. Oh, by the way, we have some, but nothing like what is being paid for over there. And of course, we might talk about a carbon tax, which they're all talking about. Taxes? And then I just had to end with this one. Britain even has what's called a stamp tax, which actually led to a revolution here in the United States.
If I had some tea to throw into the Boston Harbor right now to make a point, it would just be this. Let's look at the numbers we talked about at the beginning of a couple hours ago, where our economy is doing so well. Unemployment rates are lower than they've been in decades. We are just have a booming economy. I don't want to mess with it. Let's not stagnate the consumer. Let's not stagnate sales of products. I mean, I think our economy is doing well, and what they're really talking about is an overhaul of a system we're all very familiar with and have been using for decades. And to me, that's a social experiment, or an economic experiment, I should say, that I would not be willing to have after watching Europe do that first.
Well, and as you mentioned, there's other taxes they have, the hotel taxes. They were at one point, I don't remember if they still have this, they were going to have a tax. So you're coming into the country, you had to pay a tax. Now, there's airline taxes, but if you were entering the country, you had to pay a tax. And I think if you left, I can't remember if you left it, you didn't get taxed. But at any rate, they're very creative in the taxes.
Yeah, and so again, some of those are invisible, and that's one of the reasons why we definitely do not want a value-added tax, because that one is so invisible that people pay it and don't realize they're paying it.
It's the one of the most effective taxes out there because people don't know how much it is.
Yes, but the one that it was mostly invisible, the excise tax. Didn't some of the yellow jackets in France get upset about the cost of gasoline?
Yeah, absolutely. It was going to go to $7 a gallon under Macron's proposal, and he had to pull it back after he started that riot.
So again, we've seen this before, and it's a preview of coming attractions, and maybe you just don't want that one to show up in a theater near you. We'll be right back.
Candidates on the far left are proposing to tax the rich big time. They need revenue to fund their massive spending plans and also want to deliver their version of economic justice to the country. Senator Elizabeth Warren says, "We want to build an America that works for the people, not one that just works for rich folks." She has unveiled tax proposals that, added together, would push federal tax rates for some multimillionaires and billionaires above 100%. Senator Bernie Sanders wants an annual tax of 1 to 8% on the wealth of joint filers whose assets are valued at $32 million or above. Columnist Megan McArdle of The Washington Post finds it strange that Senator Warren is so appealing to affluent voters. She points out that there is one thing a wealth tax can do better than anything else: destroy fortunes. Both Senators Warren and Sanders ignore the fact that Europe has tried wealth taxes and mostly rejected them because they didn't work. Sweden's 70s-era wealth tax was relatively small, but still drove out some of the country's brightest citizens, like IKEA founder Ingvar Kamprad, before the country repealed it. Germany had a 0.5 to 0.7% tax on personal and corporate wealth for nearly 2 decades before dropping it. Some on the left want to reimpose it, but studies show this would shrink gross domestic product by 5% and employment by 2%. Some 70,000 millionaires have left France since 2000 because of its wealth tax. Of the 12 European countries that had wealth taxes in 1990, only 3 have them today. The revenue raised just wasn't worth the administrative burden or the damage to the economy and the jobs picture. The wealth tax is immoral. It's a confiscatory tax on assets accumulated from work, thrift, and investment that have already been taxed once. The Wall Street Journal calls it the ultimate populist envy tax. We must avoid it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and since I have Merrill and Chelsey here, I thought I'd just look ahead to the fact that we're going to have another Democratic debate. On that debate stage, you're going to have Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Tom Steyer, Pete Buttigieg, as well as Amy Klobuchar. And if he was able to get enough donors, certainly Michael Bloomberg, he certainly has at least a high enough percentage in the polls, which shows what happens when you spend $30 million on TV ads. But there is something in common with all these individuals. They're all white and mostly male, 2 females. That's not
And
exactly
older.
And that's one of the things that one person put out the other day. There's a pretty good chance that the Democratic nominee will be an older white male who's at least a multimillionaire who owns a number of houses.
Right.
Even points out Joe Biden has 2 homes as well as rents a 12,000 square foot McLean mansion. That's not the image that the Democrat Party wanted. They wanted to emphasize all of the sort of non-white candidates, and we're talking about Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Julian Castro and Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard and all those kinds of individuals. But it's white, it's male, or maybe white and female, but I don't think either of the females are going to get anywhere because, after all, interesting enough, Elizabeth Warren at one point was at about 28%. And then she was at 14%. The other day I saw she's at 10%. That's the most precipitous drop I've ever seen in my life. Give some comments.
And some of that's being attributed to her difficulty in explaining how she's going to pay for Medicare, her Medicare for All proposal. But, we've seen the candidates have been on something of a roller coaster ride in their popularity. Joe Biden was up, then he was down. Elizabeth Warren was up. She's now down. Joe Biden's come back up, but Pete Buttigieg has come back up as well. And Bernie Sanders has sort of stayed up there in the 16-17% range. Most of the time he's been fairly level. It's right now, we don't know, which encouraged Karl Rove to write an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal explaining that he thinks you could conceivably get to a Democratic convention where there is no clear candidate because the way they allot their candidates, their voters for the convention is proportionally. So if you get 15% of the vote in the state, you get those candidates.
Not
and
winner take all. That's right.
You could conceivably come in and have several candidates who have crossed the threshold, but nobody's a clear leader, and you might have a brokered convention from that. Incidentally, the Democrats also have more superdelegates that weigh in on this,
right?
Which means they're out trying to get the superdelegates now because they could end up throwing the election or the nomination to somebody just by the superdelegates.
And again, Bernie Sanders knows all about that in the negative sense of
indeed,
that, and
indeed.
Hillary Clinton did. Any thoughts about that? Who's up, who's down? What's going to happen in the next couple of months?
It is really fascinating just to watch, and of course I can't speak for those who vote in the way of a Democrat, but I'm really curious, like who is going to rise to the top? Who do you want to represent your party and the values and the platforms? I just don't understand the Democrats right now. I don't know if the blue dog Democrats or living in middle America right now can relate very much to the Democratic Party that's being portrayed on TV. And I also think back to election not too long ago where we had on the Republican side 17 candidates running, 17. The difference is that winnowed out fairly quickly.
Yes, it did.
And there were always a couple of consistent players at the top. And we're not really seeing that on the left. So I'm very curious and fascinating to watch them. But we'll see. They're pandering to a lot of, we talked about this earlier, extreme positions, extreme platforms that are very polarizing. And I do think they're ostracizing their maybe more middle of the road median voters.
And one of the differences here is that there's almost no light between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren.
Very true.
They're almost identical. Of course, Bernie Sanders isn't a Democrat; he is an independent. And I've wondered for some time: do the Democrats nominate a non-Democrat to be their presidential candidate? I think it's doubtful, but if one of them were to drop out, if Bernie got a lot of pressure and were to drop out, and his votes would likely go to Elizabeth Warren being the closest thing to him, then you might see her sort of shoot to the top. But right now, there's just no clear, by this time in 2008, we were beginning to see, 2007, we were beginning to see Barack Obama starting to rising to the top. You could see that sort of momentum beginning to develop there. We're just not seeing that yet from anybody.
And back to your point, too, about it being proportional, if I were to guess right now, Pete Buttigieg wins Iowa caucus. Bernie Sanders probably wins New Hampshire. Joe Biden for sure wins South Carolina. And probably wins Nevada too. And then we go to Super Tuesday, and I was thinking by Super Tuesday, which is March 3rd, where you have 12 primaries, including these big states, Texas and California. The theory originally is maybe Kamala Harris, because she's from California and because she attracts that, wins. There is somebody that could win a lot of those primaries, and it's somebody who just spent $30 million on TV ads and is rising. Tom Steyer spent that money and has nothing to show for it. So far, Michael Bloomberg does have something to show for it, because he keeps rising in the polls.
A betting person would say it's very unlikely that Michael Bloomberg would end up getting the Democratic nomination, but that's what most people said in 2015 about
we've
Donald
been there.
Trump.
And I do want to remind our listeners, too, that this is not even about necessarily their viewpoints. Like, I don't know that the primary candidate who is ultimately elected is going to really embody the values of the base, because truthfully, I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but President Trump only at any point in time had 26% of the votes backing him. What happens is they begin to build momentum as candidates drop out. And so remembering, we saw a lot of momentum that has yet to be seen in the upcoming months, assuming candidates do drop out.
Well, again, this is something that we have never seen before. Those of us around the table remember when it was a longer, drawn-out process, but you have a Super Tuesday on March 3rd. You have a Super Tuesday 2nd, or the Junior Super Tuesday on March 10th. A lot of people thought it'd be over by then, but if it's not and all these proportions go out here, it goes on for quite a long period of time. And so as a result, maybe some of that is a backroom deal. Back in the days when we didn't have a lot of primaries, it was done. Matter of fact, John Kennedy was able to convince people that he could win simply by winning a couple of states, because it was still made by the power brokers. And it's possible the power brokers might say, we just cannot have Bernie Sanders, who's not a Democrat, be our nominee. We can't have Elizabeth Warren, because this Medicare for All thing is going to be a disaster, because you've already heard a lot of people say that. So maybe we end up with Joe Biden after all. Didn't see that coming.
Dude.
Well, I'm going to say that I did originally, if I was a betting person, say, because I think he's the biggest threat to Donald Trump. And I think President Trump knows that, which is why he gets all attack dog whenever he can.
On the other hand, you can never underestimate Joe Biden's ability to self-destruct. And he may do it. The thing about the push-ups and so forth went over fairly well, but they could have gone the other way.
I just have no idea what he's going to say. You have no idea what Donald Trump's going to say.
That's exactly right.
And you could sell tickets to the debates if those two are on the stage. So if nothing else, I think that's going to be kind of really interesting to see how that plays out. Well, I appreciate you both here. Real quickly, IPI.org, what will we find there?
You'll find all types of material that IPI covers on a range of different public policy issues. It's all available there for reading, sharing, downloading, and consuming.
And again, humancoalition.org. If you want to know a little bit more on how to make the case for pro-life, that's where you go.
Yes, if you want to hear about our clinic services and serving women every day who are pregnant and considering abortion, go to humancoalition.org, or HUCO Action, which is the action arm I'm a part of. We're working on policies at the state and federal level to really advance life.
I just mentioned that on Monday, Dr. Merrill Matthews will be sitting in this chair.
Indeed.
And I'm looking forward to that. You've got some great guests, and then I'll be covering the rest of the week. So I hope you have a great weekend. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MetaShare MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.